Fáilte rómh gine ústa cáide agus gine ústa go léir bhí an cógáil seo có-agrathe ag glúiseacht a phobal agus comhaontas na síochána is nódrochta forbairt míleata an Aontas Orpaic. Good evening, friends, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first session of this conference, jointly organised by PANA Peace and Neutrality Alliance and the People's Movement on the EU, the military dimension, the militarisation of the European Union. And tonight's session is on the EU democratic and civil liberties deficit. And our speakers are Tony Bunyan, the Director of State Watch in Britain, and Kevin McCarthy from People's Movement. I'm Seamus Rattigan from PANA, and I'm the chair tonight. Now, I'm allowing about 20 minutes, okay for you, Kevin? 20 minutes, and then say 25 for Tony. And then we'll have at least an hour or so of open floor questions and answers. It's a great honour to have our guests here, Tony from Great Britain, Frank Slipper from the Netherlands, and Felipe Ferreira from Portugal, Portuguese Peace Movement, Council for Peace and Cooperation. So welcoming those to Dublin. So now I'll ask Kevin McCarthy to begin with his section.
I think it's very valuable that both PANA and the People's Movement cooperate in organising events like this, and hopefully this will be the first of many. Perhaps maybe we should have just had a one-day event, but we decided that we had good speakers who we knew had important things to say, and it wouldn't have been possible to fit them in one day. But as I say, we live and learn. But the principle of the cooperation, I think, is important, and I think we should work on it. So my topic is democratic and civil liberties deficit within the EU. Over 250 years ago, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in his Abstract and Judgment of Saint-Pierre's Project for Perpetual Peace, "Anyone can understand that war and conquest without, and the encroachment of despotism within, mutually support each other. That money and people are habitually taken at will from a people of slaves to bring others beneath the same yoke. And that conversely, war furnishes a pretext for exactions of money, for keeping large armies constantly afoot. In a word, anyone can see that aggressive rulers wage war at least as much on their subjects as on their enemies, and that the conquering nation is left in no better off than the conquered." 205 years after Rousseau's formulation, and it would be a classic anti-war formulation, the term military-industrial complex first appeared when the then US President Dwight D. Eisenhower used the description at the beginning of 1961 as he stepped down from office. He said, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of the misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties and democratic processes. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its labourers and the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. Now, in an EU where social spending is in free fall, the one area of expenditure which is continuing to rise, although there's manipulation of figures to suggest that it's declining and all the rest of it, but it's not dropping at the same rate as the social spending. Clearly, Eisenhower's formulation there is true, that money is being diverted. Money that goes to armaments will be diverted from social spending. And at a deeper level, the EU-Eurozone integration is at bottom an attempt to overturn the heritage of the French Revolution, the right of nations to self-determination, national independence and national democracy across much of Europe in the interests of powerful political and economic elites. It is increasingly possible to speak of an elite consensus for EU militarisation between a wide spectrum of EU political forces allied with the European armaments industry. As in so many other aspects of the EU, there is a serious popular lack of support for that militarisation project. In fact, it is safe to say that when asked, the vast majority of people in EU states would oppose it and would argue for rigorous cuts in military budgets instead of continual cuts in social spending. In May 2010, a survey in Germany, an overwhelming majority, 82%, supported such a stance. Similar sentiments were expressed in France and other EU countries. And of course, the recent popular successful opposition to the bombing of Syria is in a similar mould, although EU policy is otherwise interventionist and partisan. So I'm not making any great claims for the EU's benign policies in relation to Syria, but I'm simply citing the popular opposition there was to that particular aspect of policy. I would also argue that the recent Red Sea poll commissioned by PANA, and which found that 78% supported this country's neutrality stance, however threadbare it may be, shows this country to be in line with popular-based opposition to all aspects of militarisation. But I'll leave that to Roger maybe tomorrow to expand on the implications of that as PANA sees it. During the Cold War, US military might meant that the leaders of EU states looked to the US for leadership in the Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union. As one analyst has put it, under the conditions of US hegemony and the competition of the systems, one could not speak of any independent European strategy in the post-war decades. From the start of the 1990s, which saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, the gradual loss of power of the US, German unification, and a consequent German willingness to throw its weight around in the world using the US as an instrument of politics, the stage was set for the EU making a play to be a world player. This marked the end of what is grandiloquently known as geostrategic abstinence phase. So it's known as the geostrategic abstinence phase. Or as another commentator put it, in short, since the late 1990s, the EU has moved away from being a civilian power or normative power. In other words, the values of its politics were enough to be an influence in the world with an internal focus, and has started to become a global power. Where was the democratic control of this process? For the past 3 centuries, the separation of power and functions between the executive, government, legislature, parliament and judiciary have been acknowledged as the necessary basis for democratic states and fundamental to protecting the interests of citizens as well as their rights and liberties. The European Parliament remains more a council than a parliament. It offers no challenge to the control by this political, military, industrial complex of control by the political, military, industrial complex of EU policies. And the majority of its members support these policies even without the massive corporate lobbying which forms a fundamental part of its deliberative processes. The real powerhouse of the EU in this, as in all other matters, is the Commission in Brussels. Its role is not to impose democratic accountability on any process. The Commission is more a government than a commission. Its members are nominated by national governments, not elected. Thus, a condition for proposing supranational laws in the EU is that one should not be elected. Once appointed commissioners, the commissioner's allegiance is to the EU, not to their own countries. De Gaulle once described this body aptly as a conclave of technocrats without a country responsible to no one. It is supported by some 3,000 secret working groups whose members are not publicly known, where most commission decisions are actually made and where corporate lobbyists wield their influence. Only 2% of commission decisions come up at meetings of EU, of the full commission. The Council of Ministers is called a council, but it makes laws just like a parliament on the basis of the Commission's proposals. It makes these laws in secret, often in the form of package deals between its members, and it takes such executive decisions. Approximately 85% of EU directives and regulations are agreed privately in some 300 committees of civil servants from the EU member states which service the Council, and they are approved without debate at Council level. Only 15% of Council laws are actually discussed or negotiated at Council level. And then you have the Court of Justice, which is similar. We provide no democratic restraint on any process, let alone a militarisation process. And so you have a situation where the Commission, the Parliament and the Court of Justice share a common interest in having ever more powers shifted from the national to the supranational level, where the 3 institutions are involved together in exercising them. But besides these political developments, changes in the foreign trade and trade policy of the EU are another driving force for a new European world power ambition. As one commentator has put it, when considering strategic main ideas determining US policy, a policy shift can be noted at least since the 1990s, but even before that time. The global sales and investment strategies of European transnational corporations, which had significantly gained importance and influence as a result of merger, and thus the concentration process has dominated the scene. The inwardly focused objective of consolidating a joint economic area was cut out thereby. I would just interject here just to say that, so in other words what they're saying is that the focus of the EU has been moved from creating a joint area within the zone of the EU to the outside. as if that process has been successfully completed. But I would make the point that it is not strictly accurate when we remember that the EU consists of at least 3 layers. There's the original layer, which would be the original 6. There is a second layer consisting of various countries, like mainly Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Ireland, and perhaps Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, and so on, which are strictly second division countries within the EU, despite the illusions of their political leaderships, and some of whom have notoriously suffered from membership of the Eurozone and the serious limitations this places on a country's economic sovereignty. But then there is a third level, the southern European countries of the former socialist world and Greece, which did not constitute a base for Western-style capitalism attached to their own national societies, the exception probably being Greek ship owners. But then it's probably not possible to say that Greek ship owners are Greek at all. But until the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, all of these societies were far removed from the developed capitalism that characterized the European core. After a period in the Soviet camp, they are now reintegrated into the capitalist world through membership of the EU and through membership of NATO. These countries believed, and it was sold to their populations, that adhesion to the EU would ensure catch-up. The price was adjustment, which meant in reality a prolonged period of savage austerity. The payoff was in fact a social disaster. So Eastern Europe is clearly the periphery of Western Europe. A recent series study revealed that 80% of Romanians reckon that in the Ceausescu era things were better. Thus the outer periphery learned to their cost that the logic of the EU is not a catching up, but on the contrary that of developing inequalities. Greece is today at the heart of that conflict. Part of the Eurozone, and the Greek population in general believed or hoped that European solidarity, and especially that of its Eurozone partners, would act in their favour. And now the Greeks are left with the outcome of their misplaced conduct. So, to return to the commentary on the economic forces, in other words, and saying that process has a whole dynamic to it, which is in conflict with that statement that, in other words, the EU process, at least the internal building the common area element of the process, has been completed as a step or as a stage enabling them to go forward. I would say that all those dynamics, tensions, stresses, strains and so on are going on and can't be ignored. But to go back to his analysis, he concludes, and remember he's talking about the European trade basis as a dynamic for the militarization process in the EU. European foreign trade policy is being determined by a network of elites consisting of the Commission, the bureaucracy, globalized companies, and individual EU and national parliaments, politicians and experts. Their project is being supported by the press through the rhetoric of a necessary world power to be assumed by the EU. Given the ambitious aims, reality is looking grim for the EU's world power claims. No one can deny that the global power and global influence of the US and also that of the EU are decreasing. For example, in September 2011, a draft report of the European Parliament stated that the current economic crisis has accelerated the process of the transfer of powers from existing to emerging powers. Subsequently, it made it unmistakably clear that there is no intention to quietly accept such a development. The European Parliament strongly rejects the contention that, in view of the emergence of new economic and foreign policy powers and potential rivals, the West should agree to relinquish its leadership and focus on managing its decline. Tony Blair summed up this attitude in June 2011. For Europe, the crucial thing is to understand that the only way that you can get support for Europe today is not on the basis of a sort of post-war view that the EU is necessary for peace. The rationale for Europe today, therefore, is about power, not peace. In a world in particular in which China is becoming the dominant power of the 21st century, it is sensible for Europe to combine together to use its collective weight in order to achieve influence. Even more frightening than Tony Blair, and that's hard to get, was the May 2011 German edition of a collected volume, What Ambitions for European Defence in 2020, in which it was expressed openly that the EU military has to be prepared for armed conflicts with rival great powers. The publication was edited by the EU's in-house think tank, the Institute for Security Studies in Paris. Thomas Ries, the director of the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, and others catalogued proposals for the EU's future military policy. Referring to Russia and some other countries by name, the article stated, by 2020 we can expect the European security and defence policy to need to perform several tasks towards the alienated modern states, the emerging states, China, Russia or whatever, but he described them as the alienated modern states, a capability to support hard power politics, both for Clausewitzian influence and possible direct military confrontation. So the reference to Clausewitz influence is interesting. Clausewitz, do you remember, is the famous writer on military matters, and one of his famous aphorisms is that the war is a continuation of politique by other means. Now, when I looked that up in the Wikipedia, they make the point that, but what does that mean? Because it's a continuation of politique by other means, because politique has been variously translated as policy or politics, terms with very different implications. The first one being, an almost Orwellian one, and the second one, I suppose, the more traditional. But either way, frightening stuff. This illustrates the fundamental fact about the EU, and that is the issues of national independence, of who makes the laws, whether the elected representatives of Europe's different national communities or unselected rulers or elites from outside, are the key issue of politics in our time. The more EU elites press ahead with projects such as I've described, the more national voters everywhere dislike and resent it. The more hostile will be the popular reaction against it when it implodes. In the meantime, we should take and remember Angela Merkel's famous comment in May 2010. We have a shared currency but no real economic or political union. If we were to achieve this, therein lies the opportunity of the crisis. And beyond the economic, after the shared currency, we will perhaps dare to take further steps, for example, for a European army. So we're back to Rousseau and what I quoted at the beginning. Remember what he said. In a word, anyone can see that aggressive rulers wage war at least as much on their subjects as on their enemies. Thank you.
Good morning, Ashin Creeveen. Thank you, Kevin, for that. We're extremely grateful to our overseas visitors for coming here to talk to us at this conference. And the next speaker is one of those. So give a hearty welcome to Tony Bunyan, the Director of State Watch in Britain.
Before I start to talk, I want to hand this round so everybody can see it. It's sort of relevant in more than one way. This year, a councillor, a local councillor in Dover in Britain on the south coast, wrote to the Metropolitan Police and asked them under our Data Protection Act, which will be the same one you're working with the 1995 directive, and asked what records does the Metropolitan Police Service hold on him. And he got a reply. You can see 2 pages of it here, but it's 22 instances where his political activities have been recorded by the police. This man is the most innocuous, serious campaigner who is against the live export of animals. He also happens to be in favour of gay marriage. On the basis of his activity of being against the export of live animals, he was placed under surveillance, and the first records show that he has started a Facebook page, he's got a Twitter page. He's organised a meeting with a local MP and MEP, and is meeting with the RSPCA, and suggests that supporters have a march through the town ending at the docks. This is all apparently worthy, and yet it's funny, but it's not funny, of state resources and state putting him on what is a national domestic extremist database. That's where this has come from. So I just think it is apposite to the subject today about deficits and the surveillance which I'm going to talk about. If people just have a look and just pass that round.
What about your record?
I haven't asked for it yet. One is tempted to, but it's also an instance where people here could write under your data protection and ask what is being held on you by the government. And of course they're meant to give it to you. Now I'm going to talk about the democratic deficit and state building. And I'm going to talk about post-11th September and who have been the targets of surveillance and state attention. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about surveillance and the revelations by Snowden, and does that have any impact on our lives as Europeans, and indeed the lives of us in the UK and the lives of people in Ireland. So I'm going to start with the democratic deficit, which you've heard already about, and just come at the same question slightly differently. Not different in terms of politics, different in terms of what maybe I'm emphasising. It's got many things that are wrong with the democratic deficit. It's been around for ages. Commissioner after commissioner said we must do something about the democratic deficit, and nothing ever happens. And the truth is, in simple terms, there is no what they call an EU demos, D-E-M-O-S. This has been defined as, in very simple terms, is a people with some common identity or shared values, or put another way around, how can the union institutions, put another way around, the peoples of Europe are not bound together in the same way as national communities which form a demos, or a common people who share the common histories and common cultures. And that's what's lacking. And those are 2 quotes from quite different academics from different perspectives, and it is a view that I would concur with. There may certainly be a demos amongst the political elite in Brussels, who have their own language and their own way of communicating, that's certainly true. But it's not true of Europe as a whole, because you cannot have demos just in the capital of a union. You've got to have a demos throughout a union at all levels. A demos requires a common political culture, which is dependent on having a vibrant and critical media, a force of state. It's dependent on informed and engaged civil society and people, an open and transparent government. Those terms cannot be applied to the way the EU runs itself. Let's start with the obvious one, the need in a culture in which there is informed consent and informed dissent. It's an old liberal democratic idea. It's a good idea. It's what we used to have, allegedly, in the 50s and 60s and the 70s. But we can't have that if we don't know what's going on. And there's a simple recent example in the Lisbon Treaty and the failure of the Commission to act. Article 11 speaks of an informed civil society engaged in all aspects of EU policies, which sounds fine. Except how can they be engaged if they don't know what is actually being discussed? I'll be very specific and concrete on this point. Article 15 says that all documents concerning the legislative process, that is the process from the first document to the last document, should be made available publicly. In simple terms, we need to know, the people, and indeed national parliaments that we equally don't often know, what is on the table, what is being discussed, and have time to actually influence what is decided. Now what the Commission decided to do, when it so-called Lisbonised the regulation on access, public access to documents, it decided to limit Lisbonisation to one provision in Lisbon, saying the regulation access must apply to EU agencies like Eurojust, Europol and Frontex. That's correct, but it failed to act on Article 15, which says that all documents in legislative procedure, that is from the beginning to the end, have to be made publicly available. And the reason it didn't do this is because the Council doesn't want it. It doesn't want it because it relies on what's called Article 4.3, or in their terminology, their space to think. Article 4.3 allows it to refuse access to a document if it would seriously undermine the decision-making process. And how does this work in practice? In practice, people apply initially for documents, and of the figures produced by the Council last year, over 50% of the refusals for documents, and there are hundreds, no, there's thousands actually, 50% refused on the grounds of Article 4.3 of people not getting access to documents currently under discussion. Now, there's nothing interests people more who are in the European Union than to find out what is actually being discussed now. Sometimes we want to get into the past, that's true. And the irony about Article 4.3, of course, it doesn't just apply to a measure going through currently, it can also be applied to a decision that's already been taken. You can be refused because you could undermine future decision-making procedures. This whole process really is quite extraordinary. And of course, when you put this in the middle of the process, now it's actually very simple. And I was in the Dáil yesterday talking to the Senator and other people there, and it's like, what is the process? How does the EU actually work? Well, the Commission produces a proposal. Sometimes it'll be preceded by a white paper, green paper, or a discussion document. But basically, it produces a proposal for a directive or as a regulation. It then leaves the Commission and goes to the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union, who are together when they decide things, the European legislature. The old terminology was co-decision. The fancy new term now, but it doesn't matter, it's co-decision. They have equal say in what comes out on every single potential directive and regulation. So what happened in Justice and Home Affairs was, the minute that the Libe Committee, that's the Civil Liberties Committee, got powers of co-decision on immigration and asylum, the Council came along and said, we must now start to have trialogues. And a trialogue does not take place in open committee in the Parliament, which are open, all meeting, or in plenary, which is also open. Trialogues are meeting of the rapporteurs and shadow rapporteurs and helpers from the Parliament and Council officials. These meetings can in fact be up to 50 people. It is in effect a Parliament meeting, but it meets in secret. We're not allowed to know what happens in that trialogue. Now, State Watch does get hold of some documents, and we do publish them to try and intervene, to break this whole screen of secrecy. And the ones which are very nice are the multi-column ones, where you get the original proposal, what the Council thinks, what the Parliament thinks, and what the possible compromise is, because there's always a compromise. But at least that document tells you what are the issues. But even if you know what the issues are, you're still going to have the time to discuss them and to intervene. And it is a fact that within this process of systems, they reach a compromise in this secret dialogue based on mainly secret documents, and then a letter goes from the council to the chair of the Libe Committee saying this is the final text. And from that point onwards, the Libe Committee in Parliament, when it comes back to the Parliament, cannot change a dot or comma, nor can the plenary session. It's all done and dusted in secret session and secret documents. Now 84% of the measures going through, the Civil Liberties Committee of the European Parliament are decided on first trial secret meetings with secret documents. Now if that's not a democratic deficit, I don't know what is. And of course there are other kinds of deficits, not in the legislative side. I'm going to use two documents to demonstrate this, but if you like, in what goes on which we don't often see. And what I've got here are the outcomes. Now they're the minutes, what we would call, they call outcomes, of a meeting of which there are many a year, and since 2001 there's been 40, 50, 60, 70, of EU, US, this is the informal meeting of senior officials in July 2010. Now there are two versions of this document. There's this version, which you might notice already if you can see this version. There's something rather strange about this version. This version has been redacted, censored. It is the one that's on the Commission website. It says documents partially available to the public. What they've done is that there's 9 edits, deletions in here, so that we don't know what the United States position is. We're not allowed to know. We know what the Commission says, we know what the topic is about, but we cannot be allowed to know what the US is thinking. Of course, we do obtain these, so this document is not redacted, it's got all the decisions in it. It's not just these two, there are dozens of documents like this from 2001. We're not allowed to know. Now, I have looked at those, many of them, and what is being cut out is the position of the United States, but what is very clear from looking at these documents, it's ministerial documents and senior official documents of meetings, they're nearly all based on demands from the United States on the EU. On the rare occasion when the EU makes a demand on the United States, which it did over data protection, surprise, surprise, because the EU wanted EU citizens to have the same data protection as United States citizens, it was always no, 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 and even today, with all the revelation, it's still no, 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 we will not give any protection to EU citizens. But that is the problem, and I've just given you some examples of democratic deficit. What we also have in the EU is what I call a process of state building without accountability. Now, state building is a very simple concept. You see, no state just happens. You don't suddenly get a state out of nothing. We did in 1945 in Germany. There was a state there, new constitutional arrangements, constitutional courts, and that was created overnight. But every other state in Europe has taken years to develop. Italy well over 100 years, 150 years. UK over 100 years. States don't just happen, they develop and grow. And as I look at the eras in the EU, and particularly those from 1993 onwards, from the Maastricht Treaty, when we had the second and third pillar created. The second pillar is defence and foreign policy, and the third is justice, home affairs, policing, criminal law, and immigration. We start to see the development of a state. And in each of the eras from Maastricht to Amsterdam to Lisbon, you can see that state growing. And of course, one looks at some theories to explain this, and the dominant theory in academia is that there cannot be a state. It's impossible for there to be a European state. It's a basic Weberian theory. Because it does not hold a monopoly of coercive powers. These are held and exercised at member state level. And one could argue that that is what was happening in the early stages. That balance was still there. But I would argue to the contrary, that what we have seen since 1993, which is, if I work it out, 20 years ago, is a slow drip drip shifting towards a tipping balance of powers towards the EU decision making. You've just got to think, for example, of EU databases. We've got Schengen Information System 2, VIS, the visa database of people wishing to come in the EU when they have to give all their fingerprints, Eurodac, which is the database of fingerprints of all asylum seekers, ECRIS, which is the European Criminal Research Information Record System, and the now proposed exit entry system of people coming in and out of the EU. And also at an operational level, you've got Frontex in charge of what happens at our borders, what is happening in the Mediterranean. One could argue that their collusion in what has happened in the Mediterranean in terms of many of the deaths that have taken place there. There is, in my view, there comes a tipping point. Now, what I'm getting at is that on the streets, it may seem nothing has changed. But slowly, the minute a thing becomes cross-border, even between 2 member states, or 27 other member states, because now Croatia is a member, then the EU initiative is coming in. And the reason why it's important is it's no longer just about Schengen information system. We've now got databases coming which are going to cover driving licenses, driving offences. We have the PRUM access system, which is DNA, fingerprints and vehicle data. These are nothing to do with terrorism, in the main not to do with organised crime. This is on everything, which should be built up and access is given either directly from the EU or by access to national databases. I think what we're seeing, to summarise, and I'm going to use a play on an old Gramscian perspective. We have an EU state which arbitrates in the interest of capital as a whole, and this is interesting news that I have, not just economically but also politically, and negotiates between the competing interests of individual capitalists and also between the competing interests of member states. So it isn't just acting on behalf of capital, it's acting to work out the competing interests of different member states on different issues, to advance a neoliberal agenda and contain any overt opposition, while at the same time the repressive and surveillance powers of the EU are indeed being built up, and it's the ability of the EU state and the power elite to influence and shape the perceptions of the people as to the legitimacy of the EU and the fertility of resistance. I've done a play on Gramsci there, but I think we're heading in that direction, and it's not far away. So my second area to look at, it'll be slightly briefer than the last, was to look at who have been the targets, who have been the main targets since 11 September of state surveillance, state action across the EU. The first group, without a shadow of doubt, have been suspected terrorists. Now there are terrorists. Who are terrorists? There are terrorist people who are thought to be terrorists and with good reason have been arrested and held and investigated and released. But of course the net hasn't ended there. The net has gone wide of that to taking people who are sympathetic to terrorism, but views which might be what they call radical views. And to give you one example, in 2010 they passed a set of council conclusions. Now people always get this status wrong. It's called soft law. It's not obligatory, but it is enabling. It does legitimate. If there is a council conclusion with operational proposals in it, if one or two member states cooperate, that is legitimate in EU law. It's not obligatory, so it could be 2 member states, but it could be 28. And the particular measure I'm referring to here is something on a thing called radical messages. Quite a thick document. And it's gathering 70 items of information, either on one individual or organisation, but their views, their propensity to violence, their propensity to go on protest. But what is the scope of this soft law enabling conclusion? The scope of it is, and I'm quoting directly, is extreme right stroke left, Islamist, whatever that is, nationalist and anti-globalisation, etc. I mean, talk about casting the net wider and wider and wider and wider. And this is not directed at people who are suspected terrorists. They're not even being accused of terrorism. This is those beyond that. And that, of course, is the pernicious side of what is happening there. Of course, the second group of people, very obviously, have been refugees and asylum seekers. And if you like the dominant ideology, that if you're a refugee, if you're not a terrorist, then you're a potential criminal. And if you're not a criminal, you are potentially a person seeking to benefit economically. And a whole series of outrageous measures have gone through the EU in the last 5 or 6 years. 1, 2, 3, 4 I've got down here. Well, 3 in the EU. One is employer sanctions. These are fines for employing undocumented migrants. Now the problem with this is, you could have been here a week, but you could have been here 10 or 15 years. your children could have been born here in the EU, and yet you can still be caught by this thing. At the one level, the employer gets fined for employing you, and then you fall under the Returns Directive, which is the apprehension, detention for up to 18 months, and removal of undocumented migrants who could have been here for years. But at the same time as the EU was doing that, it was also producing a directive and initiative on what's called legal migration. The hypocrisy is outrageous. This is based on the reality that the EU has got a falling workforce, and therefore it needs to create skilled labour from the south in order to, and this is a direct quote, in order to maintain its standard of living. So in addition to the exploitation of resources, the markets of the third world or the south, we want the skilled labour in the south to make our standard of living. I can't think of much which is more immoral than the same as good. And of course now we've got a debate in the council, in these secret papers, after the scandal in the Mediterranean about people being drowning at sea in Greece and Lampedusa and Italy and Mytilene. And there's a debate in the council, in papers we're not meant to see but we have published them, because there's a commission proposal saying here are the rules for interception at sea and what you could do and can you turn them back, and that's 2.5 pages. They don't want to amend that. There's another 2 pages on the obligation of search and rescue. A detailed operational, not specific, a general operational policy about what member states would have to follow. And they want to get rid of that and replace it with 4 lines making a general commitment to rescue people. That's the kind of issue which we need to know is happening, so that people on the ground can understand that and campaign on it and say, no, you will not do that in our name. The third target has been migrant communities across Europe. Because migrant communities under the guise of terrorism, in Britain we have this PREVENT programme. It is about targeting and surveilling primarily Muslim communities, stop and search, looking for those with radical views. But of course this fuels a racist perspective and Islamophobia. And what it does is, it contaminates the normal social and political life of those communities. Because who do you trust? Can you trust the person who's just come to your mosque? Have they been turned? Are they an informer? It creates, in other words, it doesn't allow for a normal social and political life within these communities. The fourth target is cross-border protests. You don't often think of it this way, but actually there's been detailed planning about how to deal with cross-border protests. Whether it was in Copenhagen for the climate change conference, or whether it was anti-nuclear demonstration in Germany, to demonstrate about people who might be moved away from Calais. A lot of planning. When they know things happening in advance, there is a handbook which says after 6 months, every EU member state says who is coming, what groups are they coming from, how many of them, how are they going to travel, what are their political views, do they have propensity to violence, who are their leaders, and that builds up that picture before an event. And a week before, they were named liaison officers to travel by the same as a transport. Of course undercover, because they're not police officers, they're going to be demonstrators, and they will go on demonstration, they will figure people. But what we've also had is undercover policing. We've all heard the famous case, the infamous case in the UK of Mark Kennedy, and 5 other undercover police officers ended up sleeping with people, having children with people who they were allegedly friends with. We have kettling, people being surrounded, being held in an area. You have dispensing justice on the streets, which is what we call where they're punishing people, you know. There you are, you can't move, they're hitting you on the head until you get back. I mean, we had in London G20. Live television, people just being hammered over the head when they couldn't actually move anywhere. And are the complaints getting anywhere? At the moment, no. 1 or 2 may. But that's called dispensing justice on the streets. Then you have the use of paramilitary police, like we saw in Genoa. In that July of 2001, Carlo Giuliani was killed. And the raid on the press centre and the school centre. And the use of tear gas, and rubber bullets. And what happened in 2007, it's interesting, they used to have 2 separate handbooks in the EU. One to deal with terrorism at big international events or whatever, and another one dealing with policing and public order. And in 2007 they amalgamated those 2 into one handbook. So in a sense there was no difference in responding to a potential terrorism attack and a potential what they would see as a public order threat. The fifth area shouldn't surprise any of you really. The fifth target is everybody who lives in the EU. It's as simple as that. If you live in the EU, you're a suspect. Everybody's a potential suspect, and they think they have the right to click information on all of you in case they need it. What is a bit extraordinary about all this Snowden revelations in the EU and the very hand-wringing over Merkel's phone being tapped, so being tapped, so that's government spying government. I don't care about that particularly. I do care about government spying on people. But what they're ignoring is that since 2006, the EU passed a directive called Mandatory Data Retention. This has been fought, and it's implemented in a number of countries, in Germany and Sweden and I think Czech Republic. But this says that all your phone calls, mobile phone call location, your faxes, your emails, and your internet usage, which also reveals the content, of course, it's not just the communication data, who did you talk to? If they keep your internet usage, they know which pages you looked at. They've seen the content of your communication. That has to be held between 6 and 12 months, or actually 2 years, by all service providers in the EU, in case law enforcement want it. So there's a certain hypocrisy. The government thinks this thing isn't happening. It's happening legally, as it were. Of course, what we didn't know, what was happening in the Echelon era, you may remember the big Echelon scandal in 1999. Steve Wright did a very good report to the European Parliament on it. And this was how the Five Eyes, that's the 1946 UK-USA agreement, United States, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. It's funny how all these ex-colonies come in, but they happen to be located in rather good places where you can spy from. And they can spy from GCHQ in Cyprus and from Members Hill in North Yorkshire, massive US base in North Yorkshire. And in the old days, they were spying, as information left the ground, it went up to satellite and back down to the ground again in the receiving person. So they were intervening as it left your computer, if you like, and before it got to satellite and ended where you want to send it. They were gathering all that. There was so much of it. What they did was they had what were called keywords. They ran the keywords, and each country has its own set of keywords, through that massively. And if it threw up terrorists or baked beans or whatever, that sort of thing, it would log who did that, and they would track down. They were trying to have this massive, stupid haystack to try and make some logic of it. That system was there then, and it is still there now. What they've added to that, of course, is intercepting everything going through the fibre optic cables which cover virtually the whole world. These are massively fast undersea cables, and GCHQ could be going and scooping the whole out. And don't think Ireland's exempt. I've got a map with me which shows Ireland is totally not exempt. There's cables going out of Ireland back to Europe and Ireland over the United States. So do not think that all of your lives are not being tracked. And the one thing, going back to when technically is very important, what the Snowden revelation done, they told us, or should tell us, the importance of what's called metadata. Because what they've always argued on mandatory data retention is only communication data, it's only who talked to who. But that, of course, is metadata. So it's just who talked to who. What's the problem? Because you're at the centre of it, and it builds how many times you run this person a month. It builds a map of your life. And who have they talked to? So who you talk to is the first stage. The hot one is who have they talked to, and who are the people they talk to, who have they talked to, and there's a three hot principle. And the three hot principle can turn into millions, of course. But do any of those hops or bits of straw, this haystack again, ring any kind of bell that is valid, is useful. So even the stuff they're currently collecting, seen as metadata, is highly intrusive. There's an American professor who actually gave his Twitter, his Facebook and his personal emails to his students to build up a picture of his life. And it was enormous what it showed of his life. How wide it's spread. It could involve issues of his relationships, his physical health, his sexuality, all kinds of personal data can be gleaned from metadata. And that's why it's important. And wherever we live in Europe, we should be concerned, because the US position is this. It doesn't, you don't know it. If any data passes through the United States and comes back here, or ends up in the United States, they have a right to take it and you can get stuffed. Because that's what their law says they can do under FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Security Act. There is no protection whatsoever. The only protection there is actually for US citizens. And they've even been abusing that. Anyway, so I will now finish. I suppose I'd like to say one last thing then. The problem we've been talking about in all of this is, and I use the term informed dissent and informed consent, not the kind of manufactured consensus we have. You see, democracy does not belong to politicians, parties and parliaments. Democracy belongs to the people. And we've actually got to start from that basis again. Start to create and work towards it. For goodness sake, the media is not a force of state. It is pathetic on many occasions, but we need someone who gets some heroes in moments like now. But we need a vibrant media. We need an informed people. We need people who say, I want to know, please tell me, or how can I find out? Because what we need is a good culture of diversity and debate, dissent and tolerance, a sense of history, and underlying humanity, which sustains us between elections. And in that space, we can engage and try to influence what is being decided and done in our name. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much to Tony there for that very wide survey of the surveillance that is going on everybody's communication.